should think about when you build anything for developers. And I'll give examples, and I think these rules are sort of relevant to building tools for developers no matter what technology stack you're in, but of course my experience is in web stuff, so most of my examples will be kind of focused around that. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers, so any burning questions you have, you may attempt to get me to answer. I have a standard disclaimer that I'm here as your friend Jeff. I'm not here representing the giant corporate entity that is Microsoft, so please don't go and tweet about what Microsoft thinks or says, because I don't know what Microsoft thinks or says. I only know what Jeff thinks and says. So, all right, who am I? So I'm, well, besides some guy who's up here, I have been doing web stuff, let's say, since about 2005, which I guess is 14 years now, which is really crazy. And I started with PHP, doing like static HTML and CSS way back when, and then Ajax took off, and all these front-end web apps sort of came on, so I did more of that. And I still consider myself a full-stack developer, but I've kind of done up and down the stack on the website. I worked at Google for a couple of years, mostly in developer programs, so I got to go to like Google I/O and give some talks, and I supported things like the YouTube API, things that smart TVs abuse to show YouTube on them. I had to also support like the Docs API, the Sheets API, some defunct ones like Google Health and Google Wave, if anyone remembers that thing. Yeah, right? Very short-lived. Since 2009, I've been at Microsoft, and I've worked on a bunch of different things. One of the highlights, though, was this thing called Project Monaco, which now you may know as VS Code. So that's a really cool team. And one of the really special things about that, it's kind of a text editor, is it was the first time I worked on a product where we used the product to build itself. So it was really weird, right? Like you're writing code for the thing that you're using to write code. And it was really cool, though, because it gave me a chance to like, hey, if you didn't like something, you could change it really easily, and you knew if you didn't like it because you had to use it every day. I also worked on the OneDrive front end, and then now my current home is on the Microsoft Edge team, specifically in the browser or the developer experiences. So that means I work mostly on these things. So if you hit F12 in your browser, you see some tools, and you can try to wonder why your CSS is still not working the way you hope it would. And this talk, if I had given it like last, let's say August, would be a pretty different talk, because I would be talking about, we've been spending all this effort renovating the tools, because part of why I joined that team is I was a web developer at Microsoft, and when you're a web developer at Microsoft, your web apps have to work in the Microsoft browser, of course. And the tools were not great. So I was frustrated with them. And something you may not know is that these tools are actually written using HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So it's all web stuff in there. So I'm like, oh crap, like I actually have the skills to go help, and I don't like them, so I should probably do something about that. So I joined the team, and I was like, okay, we're gonna update everything, we're gonna move to React and Redux, and use Webpack and TypeScript, all these great new things. We got performance down, so it's like, it took like 12 seconds to launch, now it's less than 1 second to launch, all these great things. We put a standalone app in the store so we could iterate faster, since, right now, Edge was only updating every time Windows updated, which is like twice a year, not a great rate for a browser. And we got like remote debugging, it was all great, right? And so I think if I had given that talk last August, you might have left here thinking, yeah, this Jeff guy has said some good stuff, maybe I'll actually try out Edge again, maybe it'll get there, get as good as Chrome. And then this happened, right? If you've paid attention to browser news recently. So if you haven't seen this, last December here, Microsoft announced that we're going to be using the Chromium project for the next version of Edge. So what that means is that Chrome is based on top of the Chromium project, basically. And now in the future, Edge is going to use the same layout engine, which is Blink, and the same JavaScript engine, which is V8. So good news, we solved the compatibility problem really easily. One hopes, right? And also it will let us ship a lot faster, which we're really excited about. And also ship not to just the latest version of Windows, because I don't know about you, but I hate updating my operating system to get a new browser. That's a little ridiculous. The downside is that Chrome and the Chromium project already have these amazing dev tools, right? The ones that I was trying to get as good as. So all that stuff we were working on, well, now we're gonna work on some other stuff. So I spent the last few months ramping up on the Chromium code base. But the exciting thing about this is now it actually gives, especially me, a chance to contribute back to the web, right? So if I make a fix to the Chromium project, the DevTools there, it goes not just to the Edge browser, but also to Chrome and to Brave and to Vivaldi and Opera and all those other things that are based on top of Chromium, which is really exciting. But I won't lie, it was kind of like these like 5 stages of grief as you go through this project you invested so much of yourself in. That actually brings me to the first of the 6 rules. And again, there's really no reason for 6, I just came up with 6. All right, the first rule is the web moves fast, right? You will, if you don't have a visceral feeling of this trying to understand web stuff already, you will as soon as you start to learn anything, because it is like a mile a minute. But at the same time, because it's moving so fast, you should always bet on the web. It's able to adapt, it's able to evolve so quickly, and you don't really want to bet against it, because then you might be like these folks, where in 2010, Wired was like, the web is dead, we have apps for everything, why would we ever need to use a web browser, right? It was kind of short-sighted, honestly. They didn't think that web browsers were going to survive. And there was also this, right, where kind of when Microsoft abandoned Internet Explorer for a while and wasn't actively developing it, it was because everyone thought, oh, Flash is the future. The browser is just this dumb shell that's going to deliver you an app experience through something written with like Adobe Flash, or the Microsoft competitor was Silverlight. But of course, the web didn't actually die in 2010. It's alive and well, I'm happy to say. And web standards have also replaced things like Flash. This is some data from the Chromium project. As you can see, Flash is basically gone now. I think it was just used for a little bit longer to do kind of sketchy stuff, like steal your clipboard or play music or track you in the background. They've kind of addressed that. So yes, the web moves fast. You should always bet on it. And kind of the way to survive in that fast-moving web world, I think, is just to stay humble and keep learning and trying new things. But also don't get overwhelmed, right? Like you can't ever learn everything. It's like how you can't watch everything on Netflix, and you probably wouldn't want to, for that matter. But because the web's moving so fast, even if you learned everything, it's going to be out of date in a couple of years anyway, right? So I think the thing that you should think about when you're looking at a new framework, new language, new technology, is kind of like, what is it really helping you do? What are how can you improve yourself with it by like learning about new patterns or new ways of thinking or that sort of thing? Because that stuff transfers, right? If you invest in yourself, that's not going to be obsolete, and you can always learn like the latest framework, the latest buzzword, or whatever. All right, and in that spirit of like everyone is struggling to keep up, here's some stuff that I even need to keep up with. So this person who just said he had 14 years of experience and knows a bunch of stuff. I use a lot of React. So people familiar with React here, or at least heard of it, kind of. So it's a very popular framework now. It basically just helps you assemble HTML. Helps you build components for your UI. But they keep adding stuff to it. So there's like these new features for doing like asynchronous loading of components, and there's this new stuff called hooks, which gets away from classes because there's of course a religious war in computer science about classical versus functional development, and we have to always go to one extreme or the other. Another thing is, as typically happens, I used to use this styling library called Glamour, and the author just said, yeah, I'm not going to support that one anymore. Sorry. So I have to learn about a new way to style my components, and there's this fancy new thing called styled components. So yeah, it never stops, and it really is for everyone. But it does move really fast, right? So this is some data I took from Stack Overflow. So they do like the survey of developers. If you're not familiar with Stack Overflow, you soon will be, because that's where they answer all the questions you have about technical stuff on the internet. So this is like 2015 was when VS Code launched, right? It's a text editor for Microsoft. And you can see 2015 they didn't even make the chart. Like they didn't have a bar for it. It's not even a blip. But then in the next year, they already got up to 7%. The year after that, they're up to 24%. And then as of last year, for web developers, they're the top tool with like, almost 39% usage. So that's like in 3 years, right? You have something that was not even there to being the de facto thing a lot of developers are using, which is crazy, right? That's compared to other industries, that sort of thing doesn't happen. But you might also notice, like, so the green bar is VS Code, the dark blue bar is Notepad++, and the middle bar is Sublime, which is another editor that came out before VS Code. But you might notice that these numbers don't add up to like 100, right? And there's even more that I clipped from this, just because it wouldn't fit on one graph. That's because developers don't just use one tool, right? They might use multiple tools for the same thing, which is kind of neat. It's not a zero-sum game where the winner takes all and you have to use one or the other. Developers might be more comfortable using one tool for one language or for one project and a different tool for another language or another project. So kind of your opportunity if you're trying to build something for developers is that even if you look in a space where people are pretty happy or they have a lot of tools already, there's still a lot of room for you. Like there's still a lot of ways that you can find something that appeals to them. And so that's kind of my last point about this. Devs are not loyal, right? They're going to go with what works. Like if you need to get something done, you're not going to sit there and be like, well, I had a really good brand experience with this company, so I guess I have to use their stuff, even though it would save me time to use this other thing that just came out. Like, no, you're not going to think about that, right? You're just going to be, okay, this works, this is better. Your friend shows you something, it saves you time, you're just going to do that. And then, if you're building something for developers, you have to think about, what are your users actually want? What are the developers who are going to use your stuff going to benefit from, what you're trying to do? Don't always look at the competitors and just build the same thing they have, because who cares? They would just use that thing they already know, right? But if there's something that's underserved or difficult to do, because there's always some developer pain in anything you're trying to do, focus on that, and that will be a lot easier for you. All right, rule number 2 is be transparent. I think it's just a good life motto, but developers, especially as a customer, have a really good bullshit sensor, right? Like they're going to be able to tell if you're just doing marketing fluff. They're going to see through you. They're going to call you out on Hacker News, and you're going to feel bad. So as much as possible, I think just be honest with your customers, and that can just be like if you're behind, like guess what? They're developers too. You can say things like, yeah, there was a big security thing. We had to go spend all our effort at this milestone fixing that, or this platform we build on top of changed all their APIs. Sorry, we had to update, right? And developers will understand that these things happen. But if you don't tell them why you're delaying it, and you just kind of waffle about it, oh, we have to make the best experience for you, just wait a little bit longer. They're going to be a little annoyed because they don't understand what's going on. But you'll be surprised if you have some transparency how much that can help. In that vein, roadmaps, public roadmaps can help. Public issue trackers are a little bit better too, because then they can actually see the bugs and items that you're working on. So this is, Chrome does this nice thing where the Chromium project has this platform status where you can see all upcoming web standards and features. You can link to the spec. You can see when they're landing, what version they're in, if they're even just proposed. They also have, for the Chromium project, all the issues that are there, and you can see what the status is on them, if other people have found them, if there's workarounds, if a developer is actually working on them. Doing these sorts of things, I think, really helps people feel like your project is alive and well, and they know kind of how they can engage with you. Another great resource, because we live in the year 2019 now, is Twitter, right? It's been around forever, but you can actually talk to your customers directly. A lot of developers are on Twitter, and so one of the things that the web platform team did for Edge, we made it really easy to file bugs on the Edge web platform. You can actually just do a hashtag Edge bug, and then a robot will helpfully file that for you, so you don't have to log into some system and register and all this other junk. And then what you kind of maybe not quite see at the bottom there, one of the actual developers on the layout team actually saw this and then CC'd another developer. So they actually monitor this stuff. And that kind of direct engagement I think helps a lot, right? Because if you're building something for consumers, you have millions and millions of users, you can't really do this one-to-one stuff as much. But usually for developers, it's a much smaller audience, and you can do a lot more intimate engagements, and people really respond well to that. So why do you want to do this sort of thing? Because you want to, rule number 3, nurture your community, right? Because if you're an open source project, you can actually get free code, free work from them. That's great. But even if you're not, you can still benefit because they're going to report bugs to you, they're going to suggest features to you, they're going to tell you what's wrong or right with your software, and that sort of feedback is really valuable. And really all you have to do is just be nice and talk to them, which is pretty easy, right? Furthermore, if you have any kind of support, there's problems with your thing that you've built, if you have a community around it, if you have fans, they'll help each other. And that makes your life a little bit easier because you don't have to focus all this time just trying to get people to get unstuck. You can actually keep working on the product itself. And then of course, if you have fans and they're very loud and happy, that's going to greatly help with adoption as well, which is hopefully your aim as well. So how do you nurture community? Here's one good example. A lot of projects, open source projects, are on GitHub. That's a great place already. But what can you do that gives you a little bit of an edge? So this is the TypeScript project. TypeScript is a type superset of JavaScript that helps you develop a little bit faster. One of the things they do is they have a very nicely curated issue tracker. So now they can see things like, so if you want to contribute, you want to help them out, they have this little label, it's like help wanted. And if you don't know, like you're kind of new to this area, this project, you don't know what their code looks like, they even have this another label called good first issue. So if you're just some person rolling up and you're like, hey, I want to try contributing to open source, they've made it easy for you to find something that you can actually work on. And so if you're just some student, some college kid, some whoever, you can actually go and find an issue that you want to work on, talk to them, and then contribute back to a project that goes out to thousands of developers, is used in products that reach millions of users, and you don't have to do anything, right? Like that's just available to you today. That's crazy, right? You didn't used to be able to participate that easily in these things. Another good thing that you can do is thank people, right? So every month VS Code comes out with a new release. And one of the things they do every month, is they go through and they list out every person who's contributed to that release, even if it was like a pretty small change or some minor bug fix. It's not that much effort, right, to go and do that, but I bet if you're one of these people who gets your contribution recognized, you feel pretty good about that, right? So again, it's like these little things you can do to engage with people and make them feel good, and then they like you, and then they help you out too. So kind of the point I'm trying to make here is that open source is really your friend, especially if you're working on the web, right? There's, it says here, 31 million developers on GitHub, 96 million repositories, NPM is almost 800,000 packages, 400 more come every day. Like if there's code that you want to have do anything, basically, it's like, I want to calculate spline functions, or I want, a functional library to do this, or I want to, have something that helps me do color theory so I can dynamically adjust, the backgrounds of my game depending on like the color the user picks or something, right? Like those libraries are already there. They're mostly free. And even if you're just curious about a space, like you don't know how vector math works, and you want to dig into a library that does it so you understand it better. Like there's so much out there that you can take advantage of. The best part is not only can you just benefit from that, but you can start contributing back. And here's kind of my low-key plug of why you might want to open source something you work on. So say you build a tool and you're gainfully employed, and that tool helps you do your job. If you open source it and you kind of build a community around it, then if you want to do a side gig, or you want to eventually move on to a different stage of your career, you can still use your awesome tool, right? Because you took the time to open source it. Whereas if it just molders in some private repository inside your previous employer and nobody cares about it, nobody will probably benefit from it. So yeah, I think with open source, it's really like, don't be afraid to get out there and, fork and tweak and just hack on things. Because you can learn a lot, right, just by seeing how things actually work. Like even, I mentioned React earlier is really hot. They're just on GitHub. You can read through all their source code. They have, lots of documentation about how their stuff is implemented. I mean, people have re-implemented their API just as a learning exercise before. And some of those actually ended up becoming their own projects. So yeah, it's really nice. All right, rule 4, and I think this should hopefully resonate with anyone who's had to build something recently. Documentation matters, right? So docs are the first thing you're going to interact with if you're going to look at a project. So if you take the time to polish it up and make it look nice, that's the best marketing you can do, because if you go to some project and they have a nice website, they have some code samples, and they're really clear about this is what I'm doing, this is how my project works, this is how you can use it and get it quickly, you're going to be much more likely to be like, okay, yeah, I can try that out. But if you go to someone's GitHub and they just have a README with like one example and no details and no API docs, and if you want to learn how something really works, you have to dig into like their unit tests and figure out, okay, what the crap does this actually do? Why would you want to use that, right? So in a crowded market, and anytime you're trying to like make yourself stand out a little bit, I think just taking the time to grab the old Bootstrap template and like make a somewhat decent site for your thing, even if it's like a GitHub Pages site, it does add a lot. Because I think one of the myths that I hear from people, especially in the corporate world, is that, oh yeah, developers don't really care about aesthetics. You know, we can make it ugly, because who cares? There's developers, right? They're like cave people that just sit and code all day. It's like, no. Like, maybe developers like minimalism. Like, I think my slides are pretty minimalistic. I don't have any, like, you know, cross hatches or weird papyrus fonts in the corner. But like, I still think like there's still like a design to it, right? And I went dark theme. That's so, you know, edgy, right? But you know, developers do like things that look good, I think, and like design matters, and clean design does make you want to use a project more. Like, you know, this is like the site you get when you go to look about React. This is React's kind of landing page, and already you can see on the right they have nice navigation that walks you through all the concepts. They have specific guides that dig into, you know, things you might want to do while you're digging into it. They have like a whole tutorial. They make it really easy to kind of understand what they're doing. They have a code snippet right away at the beginning. Similarly, for styled components, you know, they did the thing which you see in a lot of library pages, where this is like a live code. I think they have an actual, they have an actual code editor here. So if you went and edited that color, the border radius, or whatever, to actually update live. It's just like these little things, these little bits of interactivity that make things actually feel alive and make people feel like, okay, this is like a legitimate thing. Similarly, Webpack does a really good job. Webpack is a bundler for, you know, just bundling up all your JavaScript code for the browser. So they have like this really nice, really detailed, like exhaustively detailed website that will tell you every option in their configuration and what it does and how to use it. And so, like, again, just builds confidence. It makes you feel like, okay, if I take a dependency on this thing, I'm not going to be, you know, out of luck and not able to get it working. This is another thing. So, yeah, docs are one thing, but please have good error messages. So this is not always a culture that people have, and you know, Microsoft is kind of guilty of this one, honestly. You know, anyone ever seen like error code 807369? Like, what is that? It doesn't mean anything, right? But Facebook actually, you know, whatever other problematic things there might be about them, they have a really good culture around error messages. So you can see here, this is if you're using React, it has a nice message that says, hey, you know, you didn't do this thing correctly. Here's like the location of where it happened. And they even have a link to some documentation explaining like, okay, well, why is this warning here? What does it mean? How do you fix it? Stuff like that. So they've actually taken the time to go do that. And the reason that's, you know, nice is because if you do that sort of thing, it helps your users, because again, developers are clever people. If you're building stuff for them, you can take advantage of that. You can help them fix their own problems. If your software actually says, hey, you know, I don't have permission to this, your home directory or whatever, and I can't write there, or you're out of disk space on your C drive, like, developer will be like, oh, okay, you know, they'll repermission their folders, or they'll clear some space up, or do whatever. And they don't have to, you know, wonder like, okay, an unexpected error has occurred. Well, thanks, right? Like, I know it's really easy to write that big try-catch statement that just handles all your error cases in one, and then it just tells you like, whoops, sorry, or like, oh snap, or whatever. But like, you know, I think for developers, it really makes sense to like try to expose as much data as possible so they can actually fix their problem, because not only will that make them much more satisfied using your software, but then, you know, it'll keep your issue tracker free of all the rage and troll, you know, emojis and reaction memes and that sort of thing, which is going to make your life better too. Which brings me to rule 5, which is you should always track quality, right? So if you're an open source project especially, there's so many free tools now to help you track quality. Like if you've ever been, you know, on a GitHub page, you've seen these little badges on someone's README. You know, there's like free tools that will like run your tests, you know, run your code coverage numbers, do all this stuff for you. And you just plug it in. And I think even if you're not free, usually these things are pretty affordable for small teams as well. Also, you know, don't put bugs off, right? Like I know like features are like sexy, and you know it's really easy to just chase new functionality and then kind of ignore some of the bugs. But you know, it can come back to bite you, and you don't want like a reputation for having low quality, right? So here's an example. VS Code, one of the people in the community, put together this you know, bug tracker for them. So it was just like, you know, how many issues do they have open on GitHub, and it kind of track it over time. And I don't know if this was his intent, but it did cause them to have a milestone where they just focused on quality and reduced quite a few issues. So, you know, I think just by having more visibility and seeing these trends and just being honest with yourself, you can be like, okay, is my project heading in the right direction, or are we kind of building up a lot of stuff we're going to regret later? The last thing I would say for tracking quality is, taking care of technical debt. So if people don't know exactly what technical debt means, it's kind of like, you start building something, and then you add a feature, and you add a feature, and you add a feature, and by the time you fix some bugs, do some other things, like the original design you had doesn't really make sense anymore, and you're kind of, doing this weird thing where it's kind of like a person wearing stilts, where the balance is just not quite good. And the longer you keep in that way, the slower your development is going to get, because you have to, keep worrying about not breaking things or overbalancing things. So, taking the time to just be like, okay, even though it's not, again, some hot new feature, users might not even see that I did this work, it's important to take time to go and do some of these things. And again, this is kind of a hard thing to sell your bosses on. So, but you gotta convince them, no, it'll help us move so much faster. For example, VS Code just did some work. One of their engineering items was, so promises are a browser feature that allow you to do asynchronous coding in JavaScript, right? It didn't always exist. It's kind of relatively recent, but all the major browsers now have it, so there's no real reason to implement it yourself. But they had, of course, implemented it themselves, because back in the day when they were created, it didn't exist. And so now they had to go through and remove 10,000 instances of this thing, and there were slight behavioral changes and how it scheduled work, and it was a huge pain, but they took the time to do it because it was just going to make it harder and harder to maintain the project going forward, and also developers coming and trying to contribute to the project would have to learn this funky thing that they had created that wasn't standard. All right, and kind of the capstone thing I want to say here is okay, in software development, you're always in this game of controlling for either space or time, right? So what that means is you can either control what you ship or when you ship. And some people who are very naive try to control both. And they say, oh, we'll deliver exactly this on this time. And then they, people work crazy hours and they get burned out and the quality goes to crap and there's all these bugs and people pan the release when it gets launched and all that stuff. So don't do that. You can only pick one. And sometimes people pick, okay, we'll pick space, we'll pick features. We'll say, okay, well, we're only going to ship once this thing is ready, once it's good. That was a very popular thing in video games, for example. But then you have some projects in the video game industry like Duke Nukem Forever that just then never launched. Because it's, you can keep adding stuff. So if you're going to control for space, you got to make sure you don't keep adding stuff. That's called feature creep. But honestly, I would say time is easier to control. So if you say, okay, we're going to release every month or every quarter, every year, whatever your cycle is, I think that's a much saner way for your mental health to do software development. Because what it means is that if something's not going to fit into the next month, that's fine. You'll ship the next one. Just push it back one. And obviously, if things keep slipping, that's a problem. But it kind of forces you to scope down to what you can actually accomplish without killing yourself or working evenings and weekends. And so in that regard, that's usually one methodology that helps you do that is usually called agile, right? So if you've heard agile software development, strongly recommend looking into that more. And one helpful tool that you can use to kind of manage your work and your backlog is called Tracker from this company called Pivotal Labs. And they, again, free for open source. They kind of learn how fast you code and then automatically predict into weeks, okay, it will take you to the end of January. And then if you slow down or you're on vacation, you can tell it that and it figures everything out for you. It's really convenient. All right, we've already made it to Rule 6. Thank you for your attention. Basically, if you give something to developers, it's no longer yours. It's theirs. And they're going to do with it what they want. It may not be what you intended it to be used for. But that's okay, right? People are going to kind of take things and get them to work how they want them to. And I think it's up to you to sort of understand those use cases and try to roll with that and make it work for your audience that you actually have. But at the same time, I wouldn't say you could be, you don't want to try to be everything to all people, because then you're usually not going to be very good. You're going to be kind of mediocre at a bunch of things, or people are going to kind of like you for one thing, but hate you for a bunch of things. That's just not as good for your reputation, I feel. So how can you make it more feel like their tool? How can you get them to stop complaining on your issue tracker? A big thing is customization. So developers love customization, because they all, we're all unique and we all have our own kind of particular ways we like to develop software. So one thing is custom key bindings. Basically, if you're developing anything that takes text input as a text editor, you're gonna have to deal with the fact that there's this muscle memory from developers since the dawn of time, where there's two ancient text editors, one's called VI, one's called Emacs, and you will have to support key bindings for both, or they will yell at you a lot. So plan for that. The other thing you can do is have some theming options. It's kind of a pain, right? Just sit there and pick new CSS colors for everything. But some people love the dark theme. Some people hate the dark theme. Some people want their rose gold theme. So if you can provide those things, it really makes adoption easier for not a lot of work. Kind of the last note on this is prefer configuration files instead of like hiding it somewhere weird like the registry or some database. So like VS Code has a settings.json file. You can edit it, copy it around, share it with your friends or whatever. Webpack has its own config.json. There's a standard for editors called editor config. And VS Code does a step further where they actually have like a nice interactive settings thing where you can like author your settings with like IntelliSense help, and they have like all the defaults spelled out with comments on the left-hand side. It's pretty nice. So because again, like developers are really picky. They're going to want to know like, oh, okay, well, what if I want spaces, or what if I want tabs, or how big should the tabs be, or how many spaces? And that's like a whole religious war that we could go on and on and on about. Again, keyboard shortcuts, they did a nice job here of just kind of making this really customizable and obvious. If you're building anything for developers, you're going to need some kind of console support. Yes, you have to do it. I'm sorry. I know it's like the era of like user interfaces and graphics, but like you need some kind of console support. So this is inside of VS Code. They actually have a terminal built in now. So not just like output where you're seeing like your program compile or whatever errors came out, but you can actually code in here and like kick off tasks and do various build activities. Also, one thing I didn't have a screenshot of, VS Code can launch from the command line. So if you're in a directory, you just type code and then a directory name that will launch with VS Code on that directory. So little things like that make your life easier. Command line switches for that sort of thing too are good. And then the last part, this is your ultimate escape hatch when you're building anything for developers. Add extensibility into it, right? Like have good APIs. Because again, developers are going to do whatever they want with it, and you might not want to build a text editor for like machine learning people, or for writing vertex shaders, or for any other little niche thing. But they can make it do that as long as you give them the right hooks to do it. So like built into VS Code is this nice extension marketplace where you can see all the extensions the community has contributed. And there's people who are like, okay, I really want to use it to do like Python and data science, and like they can make it into that without the core product having to try to like encompass all these things and then just become this big, slow, bloated mess, right? Which nobody really wants, right? So I'd say it's usually better to do one thing really well than integrate with a lot of other things. Like that's kind of why I like React, to go back to that, because it does putting DOM on the screen, divs and whatever, really, really well, and it doesn't try to tell me how I should manage my data or talk to my server or style things or anything else. And I like that, because then if I want to use a particular other library, I don't have to worry about fighting the defaults in the system to integrate better with something else. Whew. All right, so that was all of my six rules. Thank you. Yeah, sure. I'm not going to make you talk. But I do have time for some questions. So does anyone have any questions they want to interrogate me with?
I was wondering, when you worked for VS Code, or if you're aware of their culture now, was there like a culture of, I know it's open source, but maybe sometimes if you have a good idea for VS Code, maybe easier, faster to write an extension for it and try and get your VS Code teammates excited about it, and then if it's a good extension, maybe migrate it over to the actual VS Code, or how does that go?
All right, so the question is for people online is basically, when I was like on VS Code, like, do you try to just add new features to the product itself directly, or do you first build an extension to kind of prove that it's valuable, and then if it takes off, integrate it into the product? I mean, I think that's a good question for a lot of different projects that have extension points, because even the browser has a lot of extension points now, right? In some cases there's like limits, right? Like sometimes extensions are heavier or whatever. But I think your question touches on a good point, which is I think you want to experiment as much as you can. And so yes, like sometimes it is easier to just throw together some prototype, especially because then people are more willing to try it out and like accept the quality bar being maybe not as high. if you don't know that it's like going to really be that big or not. So I think, yeah, if it's kind of like some idea you're playing around with, you know, just creating some kind of extra contribution that you can then pull back out if you want to change it or if you get feedback on it is a good strategy. So like when I joined the team, everyone who joined the team had to write a new language support. And I remember I tried to write one for Ruby, and I found out that Ruby's grammar is not regular at all, which was really frustrating. I think I ended up switching it to be like JSON or something simpler. But yeah, they had that kind of notion where like when you come to the project, you want to contribute something back. And at the time that I was working on it, they weren't open source yet, and they didn't quite have a formal extensibility model. But there was still that notion of like you would put it in, and you know we would very regularly put something in during the development milestone because we were all using the product to build the product. People would try it out, and then you know it usually wouldn't make the cut unless I mean, some things made the cut right away because they were really good. But usually it would like get backed out before the end of the milestone, like hidden behind a flag, and then we would polish it some more, get some more feedback, and then integrate it more later. So I think yes is I think kind of the answer to your question in a long roundabout way, because I know that since they launched with extension support, the team has written a lot of extensions themselves for things like ESLint and TSLint and things like that. Yes?
Well, you mentioned that sometimes you build things and people use them for whatever they want, and it may not be what you intended. Do you have, in your personal experience, an example of that you can share?
All right, so the question is, sometimes people use things not in the way you intended them to use them, and do I have a personal example of that? Kind of indirectly. So not to get off on a huge technology rant, because in the interest of time. When I worked on the YouTube API, right, it was a Atom Pub, if anyone remembers that thing, XML API, which kind of grew out of RSS. Because of course, that's what you should use for your API. So anyway, one of the things about XML is that it's like HTML, right, where you have tags and they have children, and those children are not ordered, technically. Well, they are, but they aren't. So in the Atom Pub world, you had attributes. So you'd say like, oh yeah, this image is the the default placeholder, or the large size, or the small size, or whatever. So we had, it would basically look like, you'd have a set of thumbnail images for YouTube video. There would be, large, like small, mobile, like I don't know, like 4 or 5 of them, and they had attributes to tell you which one was which. And what you were supposed to do is you were supposed to find the one with the attribute that matched what you wanted, and then use the contents of that tag to be the string of the URL to display to the user. Right? There was a television maker, I don't remember who it was, so I'm not even trying to protect them, I don't remember, who had hard-coded into the firmware of their smart TV some code that didn't want to write the crazy like XML XPath query to do what I just described, and just said, oh, well the first child is always the big one, so we'll just take that. We'll just do index 0. Well, then we rewrote some backend stuff, and for whatever reason, when it generated the XML, it was no longer index 0, and a bunch of TVs broke. And then they gave us, a phone call, and they said, hey, can you change your API so that the first child is always the screenshot that we think it is? And we're like, we don't want to do that, but okay. So we had to, hot fix an API backend to have this janky code that would be make sure that index 0 is this image. And yeah, that's not quite they're still using it for the right thing, mostly. I mean, I guess people also have used the YouTube API to do things they shouldn't have. Like they tried to monetize other people's videos, which is like a big no-no in the licensing. And that was kind of the weird thing about building apps for YouTube, right? Is you could monetize results, but you couldn't monetize video playback because that was like an agreement with the producer, right? And there was basically no money left in once you did the rev share with the producer and with the from the advertisers with the producer and like some of the other partners, so that it was like, okay, yeah. Anyway, it was a weird space from that, but that's like one example I can think of like people doing something that you're like, why did you do that? I mean, there was another one of we had this API for promises. Remember I mentioned promises before, and they had used this one feature of it where you could have a promise that had progress. Like today, the standard spec is it's either done or it's either failed or it's successful. It's either completed or not. But back in the day when they were still forming these things, there was a notion of progress, like maybe for downloads or something, where you'd get an event every time. That was like another percentage. Someone had abused that once to do this really crazy thing where they, I don't know if they made like a semaphore out of it or what, but it was, I had to spend like a whole afternoon untangling that code, and then I like ripped it all out and said, never do this again, please. All right, any other questions? Yes.
Earlier you mentioned building your own personal tools. What's your favorite personal tool?
All right, the question is, if you build your own tools, what's my favorite personal tool? Well, okay, so nowadays in browsers, you have pretty good support for asynchronous debugging. Like you can actually hit a breakpoint in like Chrome or Edge, and you can see like the call stack from even before your code executed, like you do like a set timeout or something. So you can kind of see, okay, this is where this came from originally, or what like triggered it, like the whole history. That's a feature they added not too long ago. So before that existed, I had this problem where sometimes I was debugging things and I was trying to figure out, okay, well, you know, who registered this dang event listener on this div, right? Like, where? So it was very frustrating, and there was no like hooks in the platform to do it. So I had to write this library. I think it was called like Hookshot or something. But it basically overrode all the asynchrony points. Like I overrode the function set timeout and set interval and all these other things, so that I could like capture the call stack somewhere, and then like I could like basically recreate that after you know, after I was like at the breakpoint where I needed to. So I was able to like get that asynchronous call stack information. It was, you know, not fast, right? Like it had some performance overhead, but it was like a way to work around that limitation of the platform and actually help me debug things. Because before that, yeah, good luck figuring out where that code came from. So fortunately, it's not necessary anymore. Although I do think I have like a patent cube somewhere. I got granted for that thing. So, but yeah, that was a fun one. Also, because I'm kind of a nerd, I once wrote my own promise library, like myself, just to like understand the specification. It's like a great way to understand the specification, especially if in promises in particular, there was a guy named Dominic DeNicola who wrote like all the unit tests for it. So you were able to basically just give it a function, and then you'd like run his unit test, and it'd be like 1,000 failed, and then you'd like add a little bit of stuff. And it's like 500 failed, and you're like, okay, and you'd get to like all passing, and you feel pretty good about yourself. So like as like a coding exercise, that was pretty exciting too. All right, I think we have time for maybe like one more question before I run out of time to kick me out of here. Yes?
Are you excited about Chromium in the Microsoft browser?
All right, so the question is, am I excited about Chromium in the Microsoft browser? Let's see. All right, so I mean, the quick answer is yes. I mean, I think it's going to be the right thing. I think there's like, I understand that there's an argument about like the health of the web, and like Mozilla's not as happy about it, right? Which I understand, right? Because they're at like 10% market share, and like that's kind of scary for them now. I mean, I think pragmatically, when we looked at it, it was, okay, nobody wants to update their operating system to get a new browser. The browser that we had was way too deep in the operating system, and it didn't really make sense to be like, okay guys, just give us like a couple years, we'll figure it out. Like that wasn't like a great plan to just tell people to go away. Maybe we'd have something later. So in terms of getting a browser to users, you know, in a reasonable time frame that was cross-platform and down level, and you know also had, you know, all the best support for web standards that were out there today, like it was really the only option, I would say. And the thing that I guess I'm excited about is not so much like, oh, you know, like I you know, we want another JavaScript engine because it helps validate TC39's work. But it's more, okay, well, if we're not competing with Google on you know, some new audio tag or whatever the new standards are, we're actually going to compete on things that hopefully matter more to end users. So like there's a lot of talk about like privacy and like all these other things, right? So like we can do more browser features, more things that are actually in the UI. There's like still a huge problem with people leaving tabs open forever. Like how many people have like 9,000 tabs open right now? Yeah. So if we could like organize those for you better, or suspend those in the background so they're not eating all your RAM, or if we could do like better battery life and things like that. Like I think, you know, to some extent, you know, there was a time when the web was very slow. It was hard to build good apps on the web. And that was why Google invested in Chrome to begin with, right? Because all their properties were on the web, and they knew that for like every like, however many milliseconds they made the web faster, it made people spend more time on Google and other places, Gmail, whatever. But the web has gotten really fast, as it turns out. Like, all the browsers are really fast right now. It's not really even about speed or compatibility anymore. I think, nowadays, if you really want to differentiate, it's like, well, how are you protecting users on the web? How are you giving them control over their web experience? How are you, not letting, like Firefox has done a ton of work for like sandboxing cookies and letting you have like different profiles so people can't track you as easily, things like that. Brave is trying to, change the dialogue with advertisers to be less intrusive and annoying. So I think like those are the areas that are more interesting now, and I would like, to see a lot more happen in that space. And I believe that by moving to Chromium, that's where we can spend our effort, and instead of spending it on like, okay, I mean, it's fun to build your own JavaScript engine and like figure out how to code, do all these like, there's a lot of people in computer science who just like problem solving and puzzle solving, and like, there's really cool technology there. But realistically, if you're going to talk to like your parents about which browser they should use, you're not going to be like, oh yeah, this thing has like the best pointers, the smartest pointers are in this software, you should use it. The code looks so clean, Mom. It's like, no, right? But if you say this browser will keep you safe on the web, I think that's a little bit more interesting. All right, thank you everyone. Appreciate your time.